South Africa's President Ramaphosa says South Africa must stop attacks on foreigners. Late and erratic rains blamed for poor cereal harvest in Somalia. And commercial snail rearing providing opportunities for young entrepreneurs in Nigeria. Hello and a warm welcome to Africa Live. I am Peninah Karibe and with me in studio is Uche with a preview of what's ahead in business news.
Thanks, Peninah. And here's a look at what's coming up on Africa Live Biz. Xenophobic attacks in South Africa overshadow the first day of the World Economic Forum. And the U.S. manufacturing sector dips for the first time in 3 years. Of course, all that coming up within the program. For now, it's back to you, Peninah.
Thank you, Uche. We begin in South Africa, where President Cyril Ramaphosa says the country is committed to stopping attacks on foreign nationals. The latest xenophobic attacks have threatened to cloud the ongoing Africa Economic Forum aimed at boosting intra-African trade. Authorities in the country have so far arrested almost 300 people. Several deaths of foreigners have been confirmed after riots broke out in Johannesburg. The unrest has kindled memories of previous deadly attacks on foreigners and strained diplomatic relations with Africa's other economic powerhouse, Nigeria. South African businesses MTN and Shoprite have closed stores in Nigeria after their facilities in the country came under attack. For the latest on the story, we are joined by CGTN's Angelo Coppola in Johannesburg, Phili Haza in Abuja, and Sumitra Naidu in Cape Town. Angelo, let's begin with you. What is the latest there in Johannesburg and in Pretoria?
Well, it's been a quiet day here in Gauteng. We visited 3 hotspots during the course of the day, and the streets were eerily empty and quiet, except of course for Hillbrow, which was bustling as usual. There was a fair amount of fake news that was doing the rounds today. At one point, we understood that there was something that happened at one of the schools in the East Rand, which got the parents very excited and very panicky because the fake news was that there were foreigners who were kidnapping children from one particular school. Of course, these reports were completely false, and there was none of that was actually happening. There was another issue though. Meanwhile, some business people in Jeppystown were on the streets today assessing the damage and doing repairs. I caught up with 2 of those people, one a South African and the other a gentleman from Cote d'Ivoire. Let's hear what they had to say. The mobs that attacked businesses in and around Johannesburg didn't discriminate between local and foreign businesses. Everything was fair game. Paul D, a Cote d'Ivoire businessman, was on the receiving end of the violence.
At that night, I was here. I was speaking to the police. Please, I need your assistance. Could you please call the fire station? They said the situation is out of control.
And across the road, South African business owner Yusuf Salaji suffered a similar fate. He lost an estimated $200,000 worth of stock.
You know, to be honest, at my age, I don't think I'm going to recover than what I've lost. Because it took me 38 years to build up this. Honest living takes long to come up. And probably my children will but I'm not coming back to this place because 6 months down the line, we're going to have again problems. And I'm not going to go through this again.
The situation in terms of insurance and compensation will be complicated. It's unclear whether government can be held responsible for arson, theft and looting.
I just want to close the whole building and wait what is going to happen. If the government is going to compensate us, I've got no idea. But for the moment, I don't know what to do, really.
I'm not insured because according to my faith, I'm a strong believer. Everything I leave in my Almighty's hands. He put me into it, he'll take me out of it.
For some people, this is the end of the road. For others, they're trying to make a living by stripping down cars and selling those parts on. Whatever happens here, it'll never be the same. I'm Angelo Coppola for CGTN in Jeppystown, South Africa.
All right, so Phil, let's talk about the Nigerian reaction. There has been retaliation there in the country. What more can you tell us?
Well, thank you, Peninah. Over here in Nigeria, there's been quite a number of reactions, majorly or mainly from the citizens, aggrieved citizens, especially some who have relatives in South Africa that have been affected or been victims of these attacks in these past days. There's been peaceful protest. There's also been violent protest in different parts of the country, especially in Lagos, the commercial hub of Nigeria, where a couple of South African-owned businesses like ShopRite have been attacked, but police were able to maintain calm in some of those places. A few of them, they were able to actually gain access into those shops and loot some valuables. Also in other places like in Oyo State, where the reports that some of the shops were set ablaze. But in Abuja, the Federal Capital Territory, security presence has been very heavy all day because of information that they have gotten, although in some other parts, like in the outskirts of Abuja, close to the airport around Lugbe, a shopping complex there belonging to ShopRite was also attacked, where a lot of people went there to, vent their anger. But the government has, called for calm and asked citizens not to retaliate in that way. They have said that that's not the best way to do it. We've actually been monitoring the situation, and we even went to the South African embassy, where there was supposed to be a meeting between the South African embassy in Nigeria and the National Association of Nigerian Students, to use that medium, the youth organization, to also call for peace and calm in Nigeria. You'd recall that South Africa has over 120 companies operating in Nigeria belonging to South Africans. So it will not, many people, economic analysts have said that it will not be wise for Nigerians to retaliate in that measure. But, like I said, we're monitoring the situation in Nigeria, and several journalists also has their take on this issue, like this one from Kelechi Emekala.
The xenophobic attacks on Nigerians in South Africa has been met with negative reactions here. South African-owned businesses have received a backlash in Lagos, Ogun State and other parts of the country. There have been series of protests across the country. A ShopRite outlet in Lagos was vandalized last night, many people carting away with items. Also, some offices of a telecommunications firm, MTN, were burnt down. Security forces are now on high alert.
Now, when you have a South African attacking a Nigerian business in South Africa, and then in the name of retaliation here in Nigeria, we are vandalizing ShopRite, MTN offices where Nigerians are actually employed. Now, as of yesterday, the DSTV and the MTN offices in Ogun State have been shut down and all workers have been sacked. That for me is a double suffering situation for Nigerians. So when Nigerians are retaliating by causing more pain to Nigerians, that for me is not properly done. I generally don't even accept the idea of retaliation. I feel governments need to get involved, security agencies need to get involved and get this thing stopped once and for all.
The attacks came same day the Nigerian Minister of Foreign Affairs held a joint press conference with the South African High Commissioner to Nigeria. The issue also is a topic for discussion in Parliament as they reconvene. Meanwhile, President Muhammadu Buhari has sent an envoy to South Africa to meet with government officials there in a bid to find a lasting solution to the crisis. Kelechi Emekala, CGT in Abuja, Nigeria.
Sumitra, there has been some sort of demonstration in Cape Town. What is the reaction of the world leaders arriving there for the World Economic Forum on the violence in Johannesburg?
Yes, Peninah. So the demonstrations today was really, a protest against gender-based violence against women. It's always been a problem, violence against women, but there's been an escalation in recent years. And just in the last week, we've had several murders of women and children reported. A young 19-year-old student was killed by a post office worker who had previously been charged for armed robbery. This sparked anger because the post office is a state-owned enterprise. Adding to that, South Africans are losing faith in the country's law enforcement authorities. So we saw all of that come to a head today, and protesters really wanted to address the president today. Unfortunately, President Cyril Ramaphosa wasn't here. He spoke earlier at a hotel close by. And you know, with any big gathering of this nature, you would find that leaders remain rather diplomatic. None of the leaders attending here have said anything about the xenophobic attacks, although it has really overshadowed this event. WEF organizers too say the cancellation of some leaders coming to WEF, that happened before these attacks started. Nigeria, though, did issue a statement, as we heard a short while ago, and they're also calling for sanctions. A number of Nigerian artists as well were meant to perform here in South Africa. They've cancelled their trips to the country. Zambia sporting authorities too cancelled a soccer match with South Africa's Bafana Bafana that was scheduled for this weekend. Apart from that, very little is being said about the violence. Very little is being said here at the World Economic Forum. Peninah?
All right. Phil, Nigeria has just recalled its ambassador to South Africa. What more is the government doing to address the situation?
Well, for now, quite a number of things the government is doing, although the citizens are saying that it is not enough. Many people from different quarters are calling for the government to do more, like sanctioning the businesses of South Africans in Nigeria and a lot more. But we know that, yes, the Nigerian government has recalled its Consul General in South Africa. The government has also boycotted the World Economic Forum and says that anyone attending the conference, any Nigerian attending the conference, is doing that on its own. Also, we know that there was a meeting where the Minister of Foreign Affairs here in Nigeria, Geoffrey Onyema, summoned the South Africa ambassador to Nigeria. That meeting took place in Abuja yesterday, on Tuesday, where the proposal was sent, and the summary of that proposal had 3 key issues that I could pick from it. One of them was insisting on compensation to the over 50 vehicles that were destroyed, or rather to people, victims of the attacks, who in that attack they had over 50 vehicles vandalized, stolen or burned down, vehicles, shops and other things. So they're asking for compensations for Nigerians in South Africa. They're also asking for speedy prosecution, because we know that hundreds of people have been arrested, but they're asking for speedy prosecution of those people, to also send a message to South Africans or people involved in the attacks to stop. And then lastly, they're asking for security update. What exactly is the assurance that Nigerians in South Africa are protected? They're even requesting that Nigeria can send some of its security operatives to South Africa to form some sort of alliance to see how they can also help in ensuring that these attacks actually come to a final halt.
All right. Angelo, how are migrants living in South Africa taking these xenophobic attacks, and how safe are they?
I'm saying the line's dropped again. No, it's not dropped.
Angelo, can you hear me?
So just disconnect for a sec.
Okay, I think we're having a problem with Angelo, but Sumitra Naidu is still on with us in Cape Town. Sumitra, let me come to you. How is the violence going to impact on South African businesses abroad?
Well, Peninah, it's impacting, these businesses already. Most South African businesses in other countries close their operations today. They're not too sure how long it's going to continue. Shoprite had to close several supermarkets in Nigeria and Zambia due to protest action and extensive damage that was caused in the last 24 hours. Pick n Pay was also affected today, MTN as well. The issue now is how long this is going, for how long is it going to drag on? There are massive cost implications here. Certainly not good for business now or in the longer term. These businesses are losing millions every day, let alone having to deal with the cost of all the damages that we're seeing that's being caused. Peninah?
All right, Sumitra, thank you for that. Sumitra Naidu in Cape Town, Philly Haza in Abuja. We had Angela Kupla in Johannesburg. Thank you all. Now, the special representative of President Xi Jinping and the member of the political bureau of the CPC Central Committee, Yang Jiechi, has met with Kenyan President Uhuru Kenyatta in the capital, Nairobi. Yang said China is committed to partnering with Kenya through the Belt and Road Initiative and the China-Africa Cooperation Forum. He said BRI and FOCAC-aligned infrastructure projects are aimed at fostering intra-Africa commerce as well as inter-regional trade between Africa and Asia. Yang Jiechi said China is willing to strengthen coordination and cooperation with the Kenyan side in international and regional affairs and jointly safeguard multilateralism. President Kenyatta said that Kenya and other African countries are willing to work with China to implement the outcome of the Beijing summit of the Forum on China-Africa Cooperation. UNICEF's representative in the Democratic Republic of Congo, Edouard Beibeda, toured a number of sports hit worst by the current Ebola outbreak in the DRC. More than 2,000 people have died from the disease in the past 13 months. Beibeda's delegation visited Ituri province, Komanda, Mambasa and Mangina, where UNICEF has set up a nursery to care for children affected by the outbreak. CGTN's Beryl Oro brings us more.
Since the start of the Ebola epidemic in the DRC, nearly 400 babies who could not be breastfed have benefited from the ready-to-feed milk in the different treatment centers, daycare centers, orphanages and communities.
Today we are in Mangina, in North Kivu, in one of the creches that UNICEF had set up. Actually, our strategy is whenever there is a CTE, a treatment center for Ebola, UNICEF is setting up a creche to ensure that when a mother is ill, we have a setup to take care of a child.
UNICEF works with Ebola survivors to look after young children separated from their mothers. The assistance of UNICEF to orphans and unaccompanied children is adapted to the specific needs of each child.
During the time the child is here, is taken care by people who survived the Ebola and have developed immunity. Therefore, they are looking after the child and they're ensuring that if the child is developing the disease, they're bringing him immediately or her immediately to the city to be treated.
As the Ebola epidemic in the eastern part of DRC continues to claim victims, children currently represent more than a third of the cases. In order to avoid contamination through breastfeeding, the youngest children and babies are separated from their mothers. Even with recorded progress, community resistance is one of the obstacles that needs to be overcome in the fight against the epidemic.
We are here in Mombasa, which is an affected Ebola area, and we are in a MSF center. And this center was attacked the day before yesterday. People came here with someone who just died from Ebola, and then the community started to attack and throw stones on this center. Therefore, MSF had to evacuate, but this is showing exactly the difficulty that we have. After such attacks, it will be more difficult to bring patients to the treatment center.
Nutrition plays a vital role in the fight against the Ebola virus disease and the infections linked thereto. Even though breast milk is a food exclusively recommended for children until the age of 6 months, ready-to-feed formula milk helps to save children who are deprived of breast milk because of Ebola. Beryl Oro, CGTN.
You're watching Africa Live. Let's take a quick break. Coming up, late and erratic rains blamed for poor cereal harvest in Somalia. And children in Niger begin to receive anti-malarial drugs to help prevent illness.
No one again began holding guns. Machine guns from police forces toward the protesters.
Were you worried about your life at that particular time?
Not at all.
The Excellency, thank you very much for your time now. What is your assessment of the state of the continent today?
Africa has the potential to power itself.
Excuse me.
In 70 years, China has undergone unprecedented transformation. From its old industrial base in the northeast to its new manufacturing powerhouse in the southeast and to its emerging southwest. CGTN offers you a panoramic view of contemporary China. Our crews will travel along 3 different routes and come to you live from dozens of locations and 3 mobile studios. Join us for an all-inclusive look at China on our TV channel and digital platforms, September the 9th to the 20th. It is New China, then and now, in celebration of the 70th anniversary of the People's Republic of China, only on CGTN.
Africa Live. Find your voice.
Somalia has experienced late and erratic rains this year during its cropping season. This has led to the poorest cereal harvest since the 2011 famine. As Toli Shabalala reports, the low rains have threatened an already fragile food security situation in the country.
According to the Food and Agriculture Organization of the United Nations, cereal production in Somalia is up to 70% below average. The shortfall is linked to abnormally high prices of sorghum observed throughout the season. That's due to a lack of rainfall. 6.3 million people across Somalia face severe hunger throughout December 2019.
The overall humanitarian response plan for 2019 continues to be less than 50% funded for this year. And we really do need the commitment of donors and all of the partners on the humanitarian response to continue this level of assistance throughout the end of the year. Because if not, we do risk the levels of people in food security emergency and crisis spiking again before the end of the year. And that is very troublesome. You know, and should the response not continue, at least 1 million people more will shift up into emergency levels of food insecurity.
Climatic shocks, coupled with widespread poverty, are key drivers that have trapped millions of Somalis into severe hunger.
We're expecting rains from October to December. We can have 2 things. Those rains can create a flood in the country, because, you know, we never been clean all those rivers. And if you don't have rains, the worst is on the way. We have to take serious and tackle together.
An estimated 2.6 million people remain internally displaced across the country. Widespread malnutrition persists, and the situation is feared to worsen if interventions are not stepped up.
What is important to note is that the people that are very food insecure are mostly in rural areas. And I think we need to keep this in mind. We're talking about keeping people producing their crops and allowing them to stay there.
The rainfall forecast indicates 45 to 55% probability of rains during October to December. This will benefit pastoral communities and the country nationwide. Tuli Shabalala, CGTN.
An anti-malarial medicine is expected to reduce malaria burden in young children in African countries. The seasonal malaria chemo prevention treatment has shown to prevent illness and death from malaria in children. In Niger, the project has already kicked off in several regions across the country. More than 4 million children under the age of 5 will receive the treatment.
The government of Niger has rolled out the seasonal malaria chemo prevention treatment. It involves the administration of monthly drugs to all children below 5 years during the high transmission season. Most childhood mortality from malaria occurs during the rainy season.
When I woke up this morning, I noticed that my daughter had very high temperature. She had a fever. That's why I immediately brought her here. After the treatment, her temperature has dropped and I feel she is better.
She has malaria with 40 degrees fever. We gave her an injection to stop the fever. The child is now at 35 degrees. As soon as a patient comes, we take their temperature. If it's higher than 39 degrees, we treat the fever. Then we take care of the patient.
Studies have shown that malaria is the most contracted disease and the leading cause of mortality in Niger. In 2017 alone, there were more than 2 million cases of malaria in the country.
Niger is a tropical zone that is favorable to mosquito development and thus the spread of germs that cause malaria. This disease manifests itself in headaches, chills, aches, stomach aches, with diarrhea, anemia, convulsions. It is important that people sleep under treated mosquito nets.
According to statistics, children below 5 years and pregnant women are at high risk of malaria infections. To help curb the problem, the government of Niger has embarked on a number of initiatives away from administering anti-malarial drugs. They include training health workers and distributing treated mosquito nets to the public. Chamrono, CGTN.
We move to South Sudan, where aid agencies are calling on the international community to support the voluntary return of internally displaced people if conditions are safe and dignified. In a joint report by agencies, including the Norwegian and Danish Refugee Council, they called on humanitarian agencies to do more to help people, particularly women, caught in the endless cycle of movement. According to Oxfam, armed clashes between parties have reduced since the signing of the revitalized peace deal. However, many internally displaced women were concerned that returning to their homes could subject them to violence, including sexual assault. In Lesotho, cannabis is grown legally by the company Medigro and is regulated by the government. Known as Green Gold, the Southern Kingdom is tapping into a booming industry. It's also the first country in Africa to allow the cultivation of cannabis for medicinal purposes. CGTN's Daniela Pearson reports.
Medical marijuana is a $100 billion global industry. The small landlocked kingdom of Lesotho is hoping to get its share of the so-called green gold rush. It became the first African country to legalize the cultivation of medical marijuana in 2017, prompting companies like Medigro to set up shop just outside the capital, Maseru. Government support and great weather for growing weed makes the mountain kingdom ideal for this business.
I think Lesotho is great in the sense that it's very untouched. So the air you breathe here is clean. The mountain air is amazing. You have streams and water here in abundance, which is clean. And so the conditions are favorable for growing cannabis, definitely.
In a country with a struggling economy, medical cannabis is seen as a way to boost employment and increase revenue. But a license to trade legally costs about $33,000, a price small-scale farmers just can't afford. Motiba Tamai, a small-scale fruit farmer outside Maseru, wishes he could benefit from the booming cannabis market.
Most of the people have been living from marijuana, but illegally. So we were hoping that this will be an opportunity for them to farm it legally now and try to improve their lives. So if they don't get that opportunity because of finance, I think it's a little bit not fair for the people.
In a country where marijuana has always been traditionally cultivated, many are still forced to smuggle it across the border into South Africa.
It is a dangerous activity, but my children survive because of this. They can have clothes and food, but I can die from smuggling.
The UN estimates that the illegal trafficking of cannabis is the third largest form of income in the last decade. But at this stage, legislation prioritizes foreign companies, largely excluding the local farmers from an industry expected to be worth around $270 billion in less than 10 years. Daniela Pearson, CGTN.
The bill that seeks to block Boris Johnson from taking the United Kingdom out of the European Union without a deal has passed through the first stage of the approval process in Parliament. This is only the first stage of the process. The second, more important vote is expected at 7 p.m. local time. Johnson's government was defeated 300 to 329. The result means that the Prime Minister has lost the support of another MP since the vote last night, when it secured 301 votes. In other news, the Hong Kong's Chief Executive Carrie Lam has announced the withdrawal of the fugitive bill, which sparked violent protests in the city earlier this summer.
First, the government will formally withdraw the bill in order to fully allay public concerns. The Secretary for Security will move a motion according to the rules of procedure when the Legislative Council resumes.
In her address, Lam noted that the lingering violence in the city was damaging the very foundations of society, especially the rule of law. She pledged that the government will follow up on the recommendations of the Independent Police Complaints Council's report. The chief executive also appointed 2 new members to the council as the watchdog moves to set up a panel of overseas experts to assist in its work. She also said that she will work with other senior officials to open dialogue, look to address the social discontent and find solutions. But Hong Kong's stock market rose on Wednesday after Carrie Lam announced the withdrawal of the fugitive bill. Our correspondent Hu Weiwei with the numbers.
This afternoon, the Hong Kong stock market showed a very positive signal that even came before Carrie Lam made its formal announcements, because this afternoon, before the final announcements, there was already some reports indicate that she could make such a decision. So right after the news, the Hong Kong's Hang Seng Index soared for about 4%, gaining about 1,000 points. And that came after the index have been losing some of its ground since the protests stretched into September. But still, some opposition parties are not satisfied with Carrie Lam's latest statements. They think that the decision comes too late, and they don't think that will come of much help to resolve the current unrest. But actually, Carrie Lam's latest announcement to formally withdraw the bill came after 2 rounds of her previous remarks on this issue. And yesterday, at a presser held by the Hong Kong and Macau Affairs Office of the State Council, the spokesperson also re-expressed central government's support for the Hong Kong government to take every necessary measures to stop the violence and to resume the order to Hong Kong. So actually, Carrie Lam's today, her statement is seen as a very significant step for the Hong Kong government to show its sincerity to resolve the unrest in Hong Kong.
You're watching Africa Live. Let's now cross over to Uche for the day's business news.
Thanks, Peninah. And coming up on Africa Live Biz. Xenophobic attacks in South Africa overshadow the first day of the World Economic Forum. And the U.S. manufacturing sector dips for the first time in 3 years.
Africa Live. Find your voice.
Now, as you heard at the beginning of the show, delegates from across Africa are in South Africa for the annual World Economic Forum. However, a number of African leaders have pulled out at the last minute in retaliation to the recent xenophobic attacks spreading across the country. CGTN Sumitra Naidu brings us the highlights of the first day of the forum.
It hasn't been easy for President Ramaphosa. Since taking office in 2018, he's faced battle after battle, but he's sticking to his plan determined to fix the economy.
The reality is that our economy is barely growing to address the challenges that our country faces. And while the economy is creating new jobs, the jobs that are being created are not nearly enough to bring down the overall rate of unemployment. We do need to do much more to increase the level of job creation in our country.
But the president now has to deal with some abuses that have worsened over the years: corruption, violence against women and xenophobia. Protesters came to the WEF gathering hoping to get his attention. Speaking at a breakfast meeting, Ramaphosa reaffirmed South Africa's position as a viable investment destination.
We are actively engaging with a number of role players in our economy. Organized business is being engaged, labor is being engaged, and indeed, including community organizations as well, are also being engaged. And we are doing this so that we can improve the indicators that everybody keeps talking about, like, for instance, the ease of starting a business, property registration, taxation, and a number of other issues.
The South African economy grew 3.1% in the second quarter of 2019, a massive improvement from the first quarter's contraction of 3.2%. A firm recovery in the mining sector, up 14.4%, was behind the gain.
We have moved to clear up uncertainty in the policy space with the finalization, as you all know, with the mining charter and the release of the policy directive for the release of high demand spectrum. Work on a draft oil and gas bill to guide the development of these burgeoning economic sectors is at an advanced stage, and the integrated resource plan, which will deal with our energy architecture, that will outline the trajectory of our energy future, is also close to being finalized.
It was another impassioned plea by the president calling on investors to help revive the South African economy. Unfortunately, it seems like he's talking to the wrong people. South Africans are in need of strong, decisive leadership right now. African leaders, even here at WEF, are urging the president to restore order in the country, stop the attacks, and get people working again. Sumitra Naidu, CGTN, Cape Town, South Africa.
Well, just before that forum officially started, hundreds of protesters marched to the forum's venue in Cape Town. Now, they were demanding an end to the ongoing violence against women. Protests were sparked by the recent gruesome killing of a University of Cape Town student. While chanting slogans against femicide in South Africa and a slow government response, the crowd blocked entry to the continental event to be opened by South African President Cyril Ramaphosa. After a brief confrontation with the police, the protesters staged a sit-in to express their displeasure. South Africa is at the grip of a shocking wave of xenophobic violence. Police say 5 people have been killed in attacks targeting foreigners in some parts of Johannesburg. Now, President Ramaphosa has vowed to clamp down on these attacks, while the African Union and Nigeria have both condemned the violence. Well, let's turn to matters of energy in Africa now. And depending on where you look, solar, wind and geothermal energy sources are abound in Africa. But despite that, there's still significant investment flowing into more polluting power sources. Well, Kenya, for instance, wants to build a 1 gigawatt coal power plant. But should African countries have to choose between having affordable power or more emissions? Well, CGTN's Ramanyang explored that at the ongoing World Economic Forum on Africa.
The general conception is that if you want economies to grow, you need access to a lot of cheap energy. And usually when we talk about cheap energy, we talk about burning fossil fuels, lots of it very quickly. And we're seeing that pattern in some countries like Kenya, for example, which has an abundance of wind, solar, geothermal, but they're also developing a coal power plant. But your argument is that that is not necessarily the case. Why?
Let me just frame that as the situation. So Africa has very low access to energy in terms of electricity. Some say even 38% have access to electricity. Yet on the other hand, Africa is very abundant in natural resources, fossil fuels, like you said, coal, oil, gas, but also in terms of sun for solar energy and also wind as well. So you've effectively got why is there abundance of supply and yet why is there a gap in terms of access to electricity? In terms of access to electricity, raising that increases living standards but also economic growth. So what we're saying in a report on energising Africa is that it is possible to raise electricity access but do so in a way of a path of low emissions. And to do that means increasing renewables, wind and solar in the energy mix.
We've seen some governments, it seems to be now in vogue to try and essentially have universal access to electricity, to try and have the biggest possible grid market. But you look at household income levels and those might not necessarily support that sort of strategy. We've seen utilities losing money on expansion. So when we talk about expanding the demand side, I mean, is it really feasible to have universal access in the first place?
I think it's not whether it's feasible. I think it's essential for Africa's growth that people have access to power. The economics of making that work, certainly the tariffs, the cost of electricity, the infrastructure investment required is something that we need to deal with and invest in. And there's lots of different models in terms of public and private partnerships to do that. Affordable energy is obviously really important, but you'll see in renewables, for example, which leads to low emissions, is coming down in cost.
And that's essentially on the capex side, because solar, the unit cost for solar power, that essentially has come down quite a bit. Wind is also essentially showing some really strong growth as well. But in a country like where we are, South Africa, for instance, you've got an abundance of natural resources, but we still have this massive play on coal-fired power plants. What's South Africa getting wrong?
South Africa has traditionally been a coal-based economy, and certainly the power sector has been taking coal and translating that into power. But there's been a complete fundamental change in South Africa. The first is it's the case that now both solar and wind cost is now 40% cheaper than coal to power. So the economics have completely changed. In the past, this used to be more expensive, but the costs have dramatically gone down. So the first one is renewables is now cheaper for generating new power. The second is in South Africa, you also have a monopoly state utility provider, Eskom. And the reliability and access isn't quite there. So they have plans to restructure Eskom, but also create more opportunities for other companies to come into power generation. And then thirdly, South Africa and Eskom and South African economy are very closely linked together. So people are realising that Eskom isn't quite doing what it needs to be doing. No one's happy with Eskom, whether it be the government trying to debt finance it, whether it be the customers who can't afford to pay for it, or the reliability. So I think the three together, cost down on renewables, the change in model from a centralised to decentralised model, and then also the will of customers, government and others needing to know that something at Eskom must change.
Meanwhile, on the international front, U.S. manufacturing activities shrank in August for the first time in nearly 3 years, with new orders and hiring declining sharply. The latest plunge has been attributed to the ongoing trade friction between the world's top two economies, which of course has weighed on America's business confidence. According to a monthly survey by the Institute for Supply Management, the U.S. Manufacturing Purchasing Managers Index slid to 49.1% last month. That figure is the lowest reading issued in America since 2016. Now, more than half of those surveyed by the association pointed to economic uncertainty as a drag on their business. And shifting now to Australia, the weakening Aussie dollar is causing financial pain to consumers and businesses in the country. Last week, the currency slipped to a fresh 10-year low, taking it back to global financial crisis levels, which it saw before. But as CGTN's Greg Navarre now reports, there may be a silver lining to the troubles when it comes to the Australian economy.
If you're looking for a way to unlock your kitchen's potential, Dean Welsh believes he can help.
And it's a beautiful solid 6 mil stainless steel benchtop.
Think Designs has been selling imported kitchen design solutions to consumers for the last 6 years. But the cost of importing these products has increased lately, as the Australian dollar has dipped to a low that hasn't been seen for a decade.
We can't go back to the client and say, oh, look, the exchange rates fluctuated and look, can you pay a little bit more money? You can't do that. You've just got to accept that as part of this kind of business that you are going to lose profitability in these projects.
The Australian dollar has been weakening since mid-July and now sits below the 70 US cent mark, a level not seen since the global financial crisis.
And a key factor here has been a strengthening US dollar, but also pressure on commodity prices and concerns about the global growth outlook.
That's putting added financial pressures on Australian consumers in a number of ways, including here at the pump, where petrol prices have reached a 4-year high. Some economists believe that concerns about how a trade war will weigh on China's economy is adding to the dollar's downward push. China is Australia's biggest trading partner. The Reserve Bank of Australia recently dropped the nation's interest rate to a historic low of just 1% in an effort to stimulate a sluggish economy marked by stagnant wage growth.
Well, while the RBA shares the growth concerns of the markets, the lower Australian dollar is good news for the Australian economy. It's a way of importing growth, and particularly if trade relationships are being restrung around the globe, a lower currency is a real advantage to an economy. So I'd say the RBA is probably cheering the lower levels of the Australian dollar.
Tourism is benefiting, so are some exporters, including the country's mining sector as a whole, which accounts for more than half of all Australian exports. And economists believe a fluctuating dollar plays a vital role in the health of the nation's economy.
Yeah, it's the shock absorber. I mean, we didn't have a recession during the global financial crisis. We didn't have a recession during the Asian financial crisis. We haven't had a recession for 30 years because the dollar takes all the absorption away.
And as global markets continue to react to an escalating trade war, economists expect the Australian dollar to remain below the 70 US cent mark into 2020. Greg Navarro, CGTN, Sydney.
And heading back to the continent now, commercial snail rearing is a form of livestock agriculture, providing opportunities for young entrepreneurs in Nigeria, mainly because of the huge demand locally and abroad. Well, in this next report, Deji Badmus tells the story of a young man in Lagos who is now running a thriving snail business and has a clientele base beyond the borders of Nigeria.
In these trench pens are different types of snails in various developmental stages, bred by this 32-year-old graduate of information technology. Kayode Okwade had hopes of pursuing a career in his field of study, but when the desire became unavailable, he had to make do with an opportunity which he was already familiar with.
I've been into farming since I was 11 years old. You know, my dad introduced me to farming. Then he used to do poultry. So from poultry, he started doing the supplying eggs, which I used that to survive a bit. So it was actually the one that introduced me into snail farming.
He ventured fully into the business of breeding and selling snails in 2016 and has not looked back since then, despite the challenges at the beginning.
Basically, we have them in 4 stages. We have what we call the growers. We have the small size, which is also the poles. We have the breeders, which you can call the medium size. We have the large, then we have the jumbo size. So, but as a farmer, you know, it's difficult to meet all this demand. At times, you run out of stock on some sizes. When I started, I had to wait about 1 year and 8 months. That was almost 2 years before I made my first sales.
Snail business is multi-layered. In this incubator is where they lay eggs for new ones to emerge. The empty shells are also not useless. They're very rich in calcium, and Kayode recycles them into feed for the snails. And altogether, that is what fetches the money.
So we have about 6 trays.
As easy as it may seem, a lot goes into keeping these slow creatures together, including getting the hands dirty. The farm currently has about 10,000 snails, and the demand keeps growing.
We sell to families, that's people who want to eat it directly. We also sell to people who want to resell. Then we also do some little exporting, although that one is not yet very solid, but it's still open for the customer base to grow based on the export. Then sometimes hotels, then some supermarkets too.
3 years into the business, Kayode Snail Island Farm has created employment for at least 5 persons. He says he plans to expand the business into a multi-million-dollar enterprise and grow his clientele base. Deji Badmos, CGTN, Lagos, Nigeria.
Well, that's all for now on Africa Live Biz, but we'll be back top of the hour with Global Business Africa. For now, it's back to you, Peninah.
Thank you, Uche. You're watching Africa Live. Coming up in sports.